let's do a brief history. You heard about Madison and Monroe. They debated for a congressional seat, which Madison narrowly won in 1789. And we had several other congressional debates going on. So debates did not start with Kennedy and Nixon. They didn't even start with Lincoln and Douglas. So those have been a part of our American tradition since our first election cycle. Secondly, we've had surrogate debates. One of the things in our early history was that presidential candidates did not campaign. They thought it was unseemly to ask people for a vote. Don't you wish we could go back to that? And so they had other people doing it for them, and they got really nasty. The race against Jefferson and Adams was especially ugly, but it was all done with surrogates. And there were debates that went around the country, but they were done by people within the state. Lincoln was a surrogate debater for the Whig Party in several presidential elections. So everybody else did the work for them so they could be above it all and look like this was something that was being sort of thrust on them, and it was their public responsibility to take it all. So 1858, everybody calls these the great debates. And their point, and I hear news commentators saying this all the time, these aren't going to be debates like Lincoln and Douglas. You know, those were real debates. If you ever wanted to read them all, remember they were 3 hours long, each of them, and there were 7 of them. It's a lot of reading to do. They were full of conspiracy theories. There were ad hominem arguments. They were not the lofty debates, although they were better than what we have now because of their length. But there was all the same kind of thing going on back then that goes on now. Politics has always had these negative sides. But Lincoln and Douglas debated 7 times in 7 of the 9 congressional districts. And I argue that that was the first presidential debate. 1913 was a very important date in terms of our Constitution and our politics. It's when we started electing senators directly. So when Lincoln and Douglas debated, no one who listened to them, unless they were going to be in the legislature, could vote for them. And so it wasn't just the women who couldn't vote. No one could because they were elected by the state legislatures. But still, they drew between 1,500 and 15,000 people to those debates. And I like to think about that. Remember, there are no microphones. There is no amplification. So probably unless you were in the first couple rows, you didn't hear them. So I don't know if any of you played this game when you were kids. You'd sit in a circle, and somebody would whisper something to the person sitting next to you. You all know. Did it ever come out anything close to what this was like? No. And I tried to sit and imagine these where somebody right behind is going, what did he say? And they say something, and it goes all the way to the back of 15,000 people. Who knows what anybody really heard? But something important had happened before these 1858 debates. The telegraph was invented. So there were reporters from all over the country following these debates. And they were then filing stories back. Because remember, the Republican Party was started in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin. And it was started because the Whig Party was really losing out in terms of the slavery issue. And there was concern after the Kansas-Nebraska Act that this was a way of forcing slavery into the territories because, remember, it was popular sovereignty. My home state of Kansas and the Lecompton Constitution, which is about 5 miles from where my house is in Lawrence, Kansas, it was a crucial part of all of these debates because the Missourians came over. Anybody from Missouri? Anyway, the Missourians came over and tried to stuff the ballot boxes, so that Constitution was declared invalid. And that was a huge part of this debate about popular sovereignty. So when the Whigs Party dissolved and the Republicans came in, it's only 4 years old. And they needed to get people elected to the legislature so that hopefully they could turn over that Senate seat and deny Stephen Douglas a 3rd term as senator. But Lincoln had another reason for doing it. He wanted to be the Republican candidate in 1860. Remember, they can't campaign for themselves. So Lincoln needed the national attention, and Lincoln needed to develop at least some strength within Illinois, which he did. And the Republicans gained seats in the legislature. Even though it wasn't enough for him to win, they gained. He was then invited into other states after the 1858 debates to lecture and campaign. So this really started it. Harold Hulser, who compiled the Lincoln-Douglas debate several years ago, and he was a consultant for C-SPAN. Back in 1994, C-SPAN redid all the debates. He and I chatted when he was giving a lecture a few years ago at my university about whether or not those really were the first presidential debates, and he said yes, they were, because they knew they couldn't debate for themselves in 1860. So most people think the Kennedy-Nixon debates were the start of our presidential debates. Not true. 1948, Harold Stassen and Thomas Dewey were rivals for the Republican nomination for the presidency. And everybody thought Stassen was going to win. He was a perennial candidate. In the Oregon primary, we had very few primaries back then. In the Oregon primary, they had a radio debate that was broadcast nationally. Republican primary debate. The topic, they had a single topic, and they ran it just like a good old high school or college debate. There were no moderators. There was one topic, and the topic was resolved that the Communist Party should be banned in the United States. Dewey took the negative on purpose. Stassen figured this was going to be a walk in the park. Think about what's going on in 1948 in terms of communism and the expansionism. Dewey's argument was, if we ban the party, it'll go underground. And then we don't know what they're doing, what they're saying, we can't control it. But we have free speech in this country, and we should allow it, even though we don't agree with it. And so Dewey won the debate, hands down, ended up getting the nomination, and at least according to one newspaper, beat Truman. And so that was a debate that mattered. It elevated Dewey to the point where he got the nomination. 1956, television is now coming into being, and more households have it. Adlai Stevenson and Estes Kefauver debated in the Democratic primary, and we have them to thank for the panel of journalists. They had a group of journalists who interviewed them in one of these Republican primary debates, and that then became a model when Kennedy and Nixon came in. In 1960, Kennedy debated Humphrey in West Virginia, which became a very crucial primary debate. And Kennedy did far better than anybody expected. Remember, he hadn't been there very long. Dan Quayle will tell you that, and we'll watch Dan Quayle in a little bit. But Kennedy wasn't that well known, hadn't been a senator that long, and Humphrey had been around a while. But Kennedy bested him, and that really helped boost Kennedy in terms of getting that nomination down the road. So several primary debates that actually mattered. Then we have the Kennedy-Nixon debates in 1960. By 1960, 90% of the homes in the United States had a television. And 100 million people watched either part or all of one of the Kennedy-Nixon debates, or all of them. So television is taking over. You've got all these news shows that are now starting, and the news channels wanted to highlight their newscasters. They wanted this to become an important piece. Nixon was a championship college debater at Whittier College. Kennedy had never debated, but he had Ted Sorensen, who was his speechwriter and his advisor, who was a top-notch debater at the University of Nebraska. And I was a debater in college, and every time I went to Nebraska, we had to hear from the debate coach who'd coached Ted Sorensen how great Ted Sorensen had been. So anyway, Sorensen was Kennedy's debate coach. And the debates only happened because of Congress suspending Section 315 of the Federal Communication Act of 1934. Now, remember that. It's going to become important in a couple minutes. Section 315 is the equal time provision, which says if you give one candidate or one position free time, you have to give it to everybody. There are some of the time over 90 people who are on at least one ballot for the presidency. So think about 10 people is bad enough. Can you imagine trying to have 90 people debate? So we had never had presidential debates. We'd had primary debates, but we hadn't had general election because of the equal time provision. But Kennedy and Nixon both wanted to debate. They were in the Senate, and Congress suspended Section 315 in order for that debate to happen. So we had 4 debates. They were all in the studio. There was no audience. And on one of the debates, one of them was in LA, and one of them was in New York, and they had a split screen. They were in Chicago and Washington and New York for the other debates. So there are some facts and some myths. If you have heard, and they repeat this every single election cycle, that everyone who listened on the radio said Nixon won, and everyone who watched on TV said that Kennedy had won. How many of you have heard that? Yeah, most of the hands are up. Not true. There was one survey with fewer than 50 people in the audience where that was the case. If you looked at everything else that was happening, that was not the case. So it was one survey based on about 50 people, and a majority of them were actually Republicans. So that's sort of this implicit bias that if you listen to Shankar Vedantar, talks about all the time. So there was some implicit bias going on. Nixon's makeup probably wasn't bad. When I show these videos to my students, and we usually watch a large part of the debate, many of them have such a close-up of Kennedy that his head looks really weird, and they think both of them look really strange. And of course, they're not used to black and white TV either. But Nixon didn't ask for makeup. He had had a staph infection, wasn't well. But the other thing that happened was that Kennedy had actually practiced. He had run through the news conference format that they had. And Sander Van Oker, who was the last living person from that debate, just passed away a few weeks ago. And Sander Van Oker had a really crucial question at one point. So they practiced differently, and they made very different strategic choices. The first debate, they each had 8-minute opening statements. And Kennedy got the first one in the first debate, and it was supposedly on domestic policy. But he started by saying, referring back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the debate over whether the country could survive half slave or half free, and said, in 1960, 100 years later, the question is, can the world survive half slave and half free because of the communists? Now, he's supposed to be talking about domestic policy. And he talks about the fact that you can't separate the two. Goes back to the whole national security issue again. Everything that goes on has some national security implication, and we're certainly finding that out more in this world of social media and the internet. So this was the way he started. Nixon began by agreeing with Kennedy. And so he starts at a very weak position from any kind of technical perspective. So those were some of the kind of facts and myths about the Kennedy-Nixon debates. One of the things they gave us was this continuation then of the press conference format. But then, like I said, new way to campaign, 100 million, vote choice. One of the things that happened, this one mattered, because close to 1 million people, according to Gallup polling, said that the debates had an impact on their vote. And that was a very close election. Remember, 100,000 popular votes, which then had some impact on the Electoral College. So enough people would have shifted or firmed up a vote that it did have an impact on that election.